Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the 1300s, which is really just an interesting time in the latter portions of the Middle Ages. This is a century where really some of the longest and most upsetting times in all of European history happen in a single century. Some three really important game-changing events, and we're going to hit each of these in a little bit of a brief fashion. Now, there are some videos that are attached to this PowerPoint as well too that you may want to watch on your own. Based on how we're actually doing this right now, the videos themselves won't play in this recording, but take a moment. Some of them are just funny joke type stuff, and some of them are actually really good explanations as to what's actually happening during this time period. All right, here we go. So the first of our situations that we're talking about during this time period is really tied with issues in the Catholic Church still. The 1300s were not a great time with the Catholic Church. We have seen issues that we've already talked about before, where there were this whole lay investiture issues and other issues that the church was trying to deal with during the course of the Middle Ages, and it really boils down to the nature of either religion versus government during this period of time, and the 1300s is really kind of the boiling point for all of that. It comes to a head. Everything has been kind of building up to this point. So, if you remember before, we already had a confrontation between Pope Gregory and King Henry IV, and this was where King Henry tried to override what the Pope said, and the Pope kind of, slapped him back down and put him back into his place. Well, this wasn't the last time we saw an issue between popes and kings across the European continent. Instead, we're going to see something really kind of blow up in a different way here. So, the Pope at this time, Pope Boniface VIII, is actually trying to assert his control over all of Europe. And the King of France at the time, Philip IV, really just wasn't going to deal with that. He thought it was almost comical that this Pope from a different land was trying to exert control over his kingdom. And there's a famous quote that comes out of this called, "My master's sword is made of steel, whereas the Pope's is made of words." Kind of, illustrating the fact that, you can say whatever you want. The reality is, I'm the one with the armies and you don't have those. So we have this confrontation between these two really important figures in Europe at this time, Philip and Boniface. So when Boniface tries to assert this control over Philip, Philip's like, "That's neat. Here's what's going to happen now. I'm going to go ahead and throw you in jail. And you're not going to be able to have any control over my kingdom because you're going to be in jail." And this is, unprecedented. No one had ever done this before. You can't throw a pope in jail. That is absurd and unheard of, right? Well, that's exactly what Philip did. And Boniface did not see this coming. And he doesn't stay in jail long, but it doesn't really matter at this point. He's quickly liberated by his supporters, but from here on out, Boniface is never going to say anything speak out against Philip or anything during the rest of his life. And this really sets the situation for what's coming afterwards, because Boniface is actually going to die very shortly after this whole situation. It was really traumatic for him. It was a bad day. So when he dies, it's time to choose a new pope. And Philip is going to go out of his way to really push his own pope into this situation. And this is where we're going to see one of the biggest confrontations in church history. And it's the Great Schism, Part 2. So remember, a long time ago, we already talked about a first Great Schism where you saw the Western Orthodox Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church split. So you had Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox. It's been like that now for a couple hundred years. Well, now we're seeing a second one, and this one's a little bit different. So right here is a video that you should watch over the description of things, but boiling it down, Philip is going to exert his control over the Catholic Church and encourage French bishops to choose someone that he thought would be much more supportive of Philip actually kind of running things from behind the scene. And this actually amounts to the election of a new pope, and this pope's name is Clement VII. Clement is really willing to do whatever Philip wants in order to not end up like Boniface. So Philip actually moves the entire center of the church from Rome for the first time in its entire history to a different city, and it's called Avignon, France, in the southeastern portion of France. And this is unheard of. No one had ever done this before. And this is going to lead to a lot of controversy. Because while Clement has control officially of the church, a lot of people think this is a terrible idea. You can't move the head of the church away from Rome. So we see Europe split. Half of Europe is going to fall in line under this papacy in Avignon, and the rest of it is going to be tied to what's going on in Rome. So the people in Rome just decide, you know what, we're just going to go ahead and elect our own pope instead. So now we're going to have a pope in Avignon, in France, and we're going to have a pope in Rome at the same time. And now Europe is officially divided between these two leaders of the church, each of them supposedly having total control over everything. So how does this all play out? Well, it gets even worse than that. Because once everyone starts to realize that, these two pope scenarios is a disaster, they're like, all right, here's what we're going to do. Let's up the ante here. We're just going to tell these two guys that neither of them is pope. And we're going to choose a third person who's neither one of these two to be the leader of the Catholic Church. So that's exactly what they do. We now have 3 popes. This is a disaster. The church had called this now Council of Constance. They wanted to elect a new pope that had nothing to do with the others. It blows up. They expected these other 2 popes to just resign because they had called this council, realizing the threat that they provided to the church. Well, they didn't. No one wants to give up being the pope, or at least most people don't. So now we have these 3 popes, and this is just an utter disaster in every way, shape, and form. So the rest of Europe just kind of becomes done with the situation. There's clearly all sorts of issues that are happening within the leadership of the church at this time, because we have 3 different popes. We have Clement in France, in Avignon. We have the elected pope by the Roman cardinals, Alexander V, and then the 3rd pope that the Council of Constance created called Urban VI. So who's the actual pope? Technically, Clement was selected appropriately. I mean, Urban was part of this council. Alexander won a vote as well, too. It's a weird scenario. So in this situation, we kind of needed a little bit of outside influence to clarify this up. The leader of the Holy Roman Emperor, who I left his name out of here because we already have enough names in this unit, you don't need to know him, just decides, I'm done with this. And he takes an army down to Rome. And he just decides that all 3 of you resign, or you're just going to die. Well, with that sort of an ultimatum, each of the popes resigns from office, even the one in Avignon, and a new pope is selected, and his name will be Pope Martin V. And this will bring the church back together under the leadership of one pope. But the damage is already done. Everything has blown up in their face because of this. The power of the papacy takes a huge nosedive. People are no longer going to have that total faith in the Catholic Church because they made this huge disaster of their own. Kings are not going to believe that they have to do whatever the Pope says anymore. We also have issues where people are just going to decide maybe the church doesn't have all the right answers, so maybe we should start making them our own. And in fact, we see 2 very important figures in the history of European religion come out during this time period. John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. Both of them start to question whether or not the established church even needs to exist, and that really the only thing you need to express your faith in Christ is the Bible itself. And these guys are laying the seeds that will eventually become the Protestant Reformation. The church clearly is not going to be okay with these ideas. Both of these people are going to be held on trial for their ideas. Fortunately for John Wycliffe, he dies before his trial takes place. But Jan Hus is actually held on trial for heresy, creating an idea that is outside the church's beliefs, and is burned at the stake for them. Wycliffe, they actually dig his body back up and hold him on trial. So this is the situation that Europe is in after the Great Schism. There's a lot of divide amongst the countries, and it's going to only get worse by the next thing that's taking place. So the next one of our big 3 issues that happens during the 1300s is the Black Death, also known as bubonic plague. Now, we've already introduced the bubonic plague earlier in this class briefly because it's made a couple different arrivals around the world. But this is the period of time that everyone thinks of when they talk about the Black Death. This is where it gets super terrible. So, after the Great Schism, we see kind of a big, kick in the stomach here. All of this stuff had taken place, and then some terrible harvests break across the continent because of weather issues. And it's nothing no one could control. It's not a situation where someone did anything wrong, but it just happened to play out that way. And people across Europe were hungry. They were starving. They didn't have the food that they had had prior to this. And this is going to make them susceptible, even more so, to a terrible disease that's going to come to the continent, called the Black Death. This is another video explaining what the Black Death is. So how it essentially breaks down is that the Black Death is this terrible virus that starts raging across Europe. The mortality rate in its earliest forms was about 50%. 1 in every 2 people would die. And then as the virus continued to evolve, it got worse. Then your odds of survival become 2/3 death, or 2/3 mortality rate when it reaches France. And then when it reaches even farther into Europe, into the Germania areas, we're talking 100% mortality. And you can see why the image on the screen right now is this really macabre imagery of people dying. This is the imagery that comes out of the Black Death. Everyone's watching family members die by the dozen. It's unlike anything we had ever seen. The Black Death destroyed Europe. It was not uncommon for you to lose 6, 7, 8, 9 family members because of the disease. So much so that people thought that this was the end of the world. In fact, it's during this time period that we see the imagery of what you see right now. These are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. This imagery starts coming out during the time of the Black Death because people thought that this was the end. So many people were dying so fast, and nothing anyone could do seemed to be able to fix it. People tried, but instead we get poems like this. Ring around the roses, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Now, we don't know for sure exactly if this is related to the Black Death. In fact, there's a lot of people that believe it's not because, I mean, the poem itself is written in 1881, but various forms of it had existed around for hundreds of years before, so it may have been relation to it. But there's some key imagery that's tied to this. The whole idea of pockets full of posies is actually something that is tied back to the Black Death, because if you guys look at the image here, you can see these plague doctors, right? Well, the reason why they had these really large masks with beaks in them was that they filled those beaks with potpourri and flowers that were sweet-smelling things because the smell of death was so terrible during the time of the Black Death. So it's something related to that imagery. We also see during this time period people come up with a variety of different ways of trying to treat the plague. Whether it was using leeches, which is a terrible concept because they only provide you to get sicker, or they were flagellants, which were people who believed that this was a plague sent by God to punish people. So they actually beat themselves in penance for the sins that they had committed, and hoping that that would protect them from the plague. So either they would use whips, kind of like what you see in the image right here, or they'd even use whips with little burrs or rocks at the end of it, so when it hit your skin, it would actually dig into it. Or they would just physically, beat themselves with boards or various other things, like you get from the video that's going to pop up here in a second, even though this is done in a mocking manner. And thunk. So, the Black Plague has a lot of impacts on Europe during this time period. Some of them are actually good overall for Europe. Because so many Europeans die, there's actually a lot more food and money to go around after the fact. 1/3 of Europe died during the Black Death. 1/3. It's an insane amount of people to die because of one single disease. But this actually made life a lot better for everyone else who was left afterwards, which is kind of a crazy notion. And this is actually going to open up opportunities here, because the areas of Europe that were dealt with the plague the first, areas like Italy, are going to see a revival of their culture afterwards because of this additional money. It's going to lead to something called the Renaissance, which is our next unit. Uh, but there's a lot of other issues that come along with this as well, too. People are going to start advocating for better rights in their life because how terrible things were because of the plague. We're seeing some of the early breakdowns of the feudal system because of it. So a lot of impacts are happening because of this. And this just leads us to our third cataclysmic event of the 1300s. And that is the 100 Years' War. So we've had one church-related issue, one virus, biology-related issue, and now one political issue. Now, the 100 Years' War is extremely complicated overall. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth because in the grand scheme of things, we just don't need to for the sake of our class. But the 100 Years' War is just a really terrible period of time for the countries involved. This will explain it in a lot more detail if you're interested in watching this. It's also on the PowerPoint, but I'm going to continue on for now. The simplified explanation here is that the French king Charles V dies, he has no heirs. If you remember from a couple lessons ago before break, there's this guy named William the Conqueror who's actually a French guy who had conquered all of England. Well, one of his descendants would have been the next person in line for France. Well, the French people are not going to be okay with the concept that a guy who has been living in England his entire life is going to declare himself the King of France. So instead, an entirely new person named Philip IV declares himself King of France. So now we have this Edward, who's tied to William the Conqueror, and would have been the cousin of the now dead Charles IV, versus this newly anointed king, Philip IV. And we have a conflict that it's going to last a lot longer than the actual people involved at the start. There are different phases of the 100 Years' War. As you can see, the area that is orange is the area controlled by the French, and the area that is green is controlled by the English. So early on in the war, clearly the French are going to control what's going on, except for a little area to the west. But as the war continues on, England starts gaining more and more territory in France. And then it isn't until the arrival of this really iconic figure in history that we see that turn around, and her name is Joan of Arc. She has a very interesting life story if you've ever taken a moment to actually hear about it. Joan herself, it'll explain right here in the video, is a product of the time period that she's in, and also a really incredible story of a young girl who just radically changes history around her. Watching the video about her, you find out that she's only a teenager when the whole story about her begins. She hears the voices of God. They encourage her to lead these armies. When she does lead these armies, the French are able to rally victory after victory after victory, to the point where the English decide that, you know what, we'll call off the rest of the war if you hand us this girl. And the French, thinking that this is their opportunity to kind of just wipe away, clean the slate here, hand over Joan of Arc. The English hold her on trial for heresy, saying that she is blasphemous, saying that she could hear the voice of God, and they burn her at the stake for it. But the war itself ended, and France gets to stay this country that, we now know today. And it becomes a really interesting scenario here, because Joan of Arc doesn't really get any kind of recognition for hundreds of years afterwards. She's made a saint in the 1900s, and it's right around then the church admits that it was wrong in doing so, and it's a lot of, interesting complexity to the story. But we're glossing over a lot of that stuff. You can watch in the video about it, but I want to go into the big impacts of the war itself. The 100 Years' War is a game-changing moment in European history because it really establishes what we know as France and England. And those two countries, from the start of the 100 Years' War, really from all the way back of William the Conqueror, all the way to the 20th century, hate each other. Hate each other. That is a rivalry that is almost 1,000 years old. between these two countries. And it really comes to a point during this time in the Hundred Years' War. We also see the creation of something that is monumentally important in European history called nationalism. Pride in your people. The French are proud of what it means to be French. The English are proud of what it means to be English. And this is going to be one of the most important concepts in all of European history. Unfortunately, eventually helping lead us all the way to conflicts in the 20th century called World War I and II. Also, the English loss in the 100 Years' War really leaves them reeling. They were this close to conquering all of France, and then it fell apart. And a lot of people are going to be asking questions as to why that happened. And it's going to lead to a little bit of a civil war in England over control of the country. So this is a hugely impactful war, and it's really a hugely impactful period in European history. So, with that, we have our 100 years of trouble in Europe, and that really wraps up our Middle Ages unit. Thanks, and have a great day.